Welcome, everybody. This is Building the Perfect Product Backlog. My name is Jamie Cooke. I'm a Director of Strategic Enablement for Trimble's owner in the public sector. And I've worked with Agile methods for about 20 years now. I'm actually an award-winning author of a bunch of Agile books and adaptive management techniques. And I speak internationally on the topic and write articles and blog posts. And this is a passion of mine. And I want to share some techniques with you that I think you will find useful in building the highest value business solutions for your organization. There's a lot to cover, so we're going to dive right in. And bear with me 1 second. I will get it up on the screen. Okay. Well, we will start with this, and then I will figure out how to present that. So the Scrum dilemma. Most of you will be familiar with this Scrum diagram. And it's pretty interesting because it's relatively high level, but it actually speaks volumes. So in the Scrum model, if you look to the left-hand side of the diagram, you'll see the responsibilities of the product owner. They're responsible for gathering all the business requirements for the solution. They're responsible for prioritization of those requirements, and they're responsible for feeding the top-down product backlog. And that all falls within the product owner, whether it's one person or a couple of people. That's their responsibility. On the right-hand side of the diagram is an entire team of people. The Scrum Master, any number of Scrum team members, and if you're dealing with Scrum of Scrums, it could be many Scrum team members, as well as the product owner, all get involved with understanding the product backlog, doing estimation, and building out the solution, as well as the testing and the walkthroughs. The Scrum dilemma is that the industry has tended to focus very heavily on the right-hand side of this diagram. And really the effort, if you will, and the majority of resources focus on the Scrum team and really don't focus as heavily on the product owner. And to me, that's a little bit ironic, because the product owner is going to be driving the definition of what the solution is. And no matter how incredibly powerful the team is in the delivery and how great their technical solution is, if it's not being driven by the highest value business requirements and the highest value for the business, then it really, at the end of the day, doesn't matter how effective the solution is if it's not meeting the business requirements. So we're going to talk about what you can do to make your solution more effective. And I'm going to see if I can get this thing to properly present, but let me just move over to here. Okay. So gathering the right requirements, where do you start? And most people, quite logically are going to start with the end user. And they're going to start with talking to the stakeholders who are going to own the target solution. And that's great. And that's hugely valuable. But it's not the only part of the equation. So you start with the end users, but if you look at this diagram, you actually can see that there's several other people who need to be involved in these discussions. And that could include subject matter experts who are not the end users of the solution, but they have valuable insight. Management executives, they might not be the user of the solution, but they absolutely need to have a voice. If there are security or compliance requirements that drive the solution's definition, then that's critically important too. Integration with other systems, if there's a third-party system or other systems in your organization needs to integrate, you need to have those discussions, as well as, and I'm going to say arguably the most important thing, is the legacy system users. Because really, truly, more than anything, and I think I'm going to be able to get it to present properly now. Let's go to that slide. There we go. All right. The legacy system users are the people who really have a point of reference. What you're building is either an extension or a replacement of an existing business solution. These are the people that come to you with their real world experience. And as much as gathering the perspective information is helpful, getting the real world experience of these people, and it's often overlooked, is huge value to understanding not only what the solution should do, but what it shouldn't do. So you've gathered these requirements. And let me see if I can get this thing to jump again. There we go. there tends to be at that point a stoppage point for a lot of people. And it really is just the next step of gathering the full set of requirements. There are lots of other sources that you can potentially be looking at. So working from the left-hand side of this diagram, if there has been any previous work done, exercises to gather requirements where key decisions were made or risks and issues were identified, that could be valuable input into the discussions. It could frame the discussions and it could save the stakeholder time by not having to repeat what they've already told people. In addition, if there's organizational policies that drive elements of the solution, it's good to get your head around those. Technical constraints. You cannot deliver any solution that doesn't meet these minimum requirements. If there's regulations, that could be in your organization, it could be the industry, it could be government, and those have to factor into the design. You need to get your head around those as well. Industry articles and forums, a lot of information that's available out there, including now with AI. You could be doing some research and finding out what other people are doing in this solution space, including the people in your network. Nearly guarantee that what you're looking to build is not the first time anybody's built it. So it would be hugely good value for you to talk to people in your network if you can. I want to put something else on the table. Preparing for the requirement sessions. After you've gathered all this information, it's a lot. And you need to sort of sort it out and cull it and make it manageable. But then you need to provide it to people who are having these discussions in advance. Give them a chance to prepare, a chance to think about it, and also save the time at the actual meetings of having to repeat what you've already provided in any kind of substantial way. For the meetings themselves, you need to be looking at all the impacted business areas, not just the end users or not just management. And I'm going to suggest that you make these sessions no more than 10 people. If you really want to get meaningful discussion, if you want to get consensus, it's really hard to do that in a room of 30 or 40 people. So even if it means multiple sessions, make them working sessions, but make them manageable size. Ensure the attendees have Miro access before the session as part of reviewing existing information, during the session to be able to provide input into discussions, and of course after, as the requirements get finalized. And then my very strong recommendation, if you're a product owner, pair with a business analyst. You might be a subject matter expert from a business standpoint. Business analysts are expert in requirements gathering and culling and sorting, and they often can ask questions you wouldn't think to ask to deep dive into what the real requirements are. Okay. When you actually have these sessions, the first question on the table that almost everybody is going to ask, what do you want the solution to do? And that is a dangerous, dangerous question, because what you're going to get is fuzzy or high level requirements. I'm not quite sure, but it should do something like this. You might get extremely detailed requirements. Now the technology is pretty commonplace. People are very aware of what products do and don't do, and they come to the table with very specific features they're looking for. You might get the kid in the candy store. Somebody who basically wants everything and doesn't even know where to begin to prioritize. I want it all. And you might get the seesaw decision maker. That's the person who, when you spoke with them yesterday, absolutely had to have this, but today it's something else completely different. So you want to open up the discussion with this, but you actually want to frame that discussion. And if you start by brainstorming and having the bigger discussion, then you go into the narrow down and refinement exercise. And these are some questions that can help you refine in the discussion. So tell me about the best case scenario or a variation of that. What's the one thing that would make this a successful solution? One thing is emphasized here, right? Don't let them go into the 20 things they're looking for. Have them focus on the highest priority. Tell me about the exceptions. I mean, it's an interesting psychology when people start telling you about the differences. It establishes boundaries and boundary test cases as well. And then what do you want the solution not to do? Knowing what to exclude also helps you understand what to include. So those are questions that can help you. But I want to put something different on the table. Everything up to this point has been talking about software as being the answer to the business problem. And there are often times when software is not the answer. You could be addressing a business issue with business process improvements, with or without a software solution. It could be an enablement and training thing. You could actually be doing more training and education to address the issue. You could be restructuring the roles and the functions of the teams. It could even be policy updates. I worked on a system once that had incredibly complicated travel management requirements and was causing the team to build all these fancy algorithms. And we pulled back and actually spoke with the business and was able to work out a way to make the travel policy simpler. And therefore the solution was simpler. So there are ways to actually reduce the scope in ways that are not necessarily in the software. And the last is corporate communication. It could very well be that there's information out there that people don't know where to find. And so they're looking to the software to fulfill a need that they could actually get from another source. So those are options to consider in addition to or instead of the software, if you do decide to go forward with the software solution. Place to start, write down every requirement as a user story, no matter high level, how unrealistic, how abstract it is, how unclear it is, write it down. Every requirement is valuable to somebody. If you need to get more supporting information, there's only that much that can be told on a sticky note, right? So you want to supplement that with examples of reports, if there's existing systems or other systems that are relevant, get screenshots, policies and other compliance documentation that it needs to adhere to, any detailed business rules. Not only is that going to help the team to better understand the requirement, it's actually going to help you get those high-level stories into more specific detail. So the question on the table, you have a Miro board that has 100 sticky notes on it. Where do you begin? What are the most important capabilities to focus on? How do you populate the top-down product backlog? And in the Agile world, there's a method called invest. And it's a great place to start. So invest stands for these 6 features. And what they effectively are saying is, look, you can't begin to prioritize until you get each sticky note, each feature, down to a digestible and achievable level that the team can actually work on. So you need to devolve your high-level sticky notes into smaller chunks. Independent is critical. You cannot be having dependencies drive the order of priority, because you'll end up having one high priority item drag in 6 less priority items because they're set up to be dependent. Do your best to do that, and whether it's a services architecture, whether it's APIs, do your best to make sure that the functions do not rely on a bunch of other functions being delivered at the same time to the largest extent that you can. Negotiable. Don't be stuck in this is the only way to do it. Identify the business problem and leave it for the team to come up with the best technical solution. Valuable. And we'll go into more of that later. There is no point in doing anything in a solution that you cannot define what the business value is. Estimable. If it is not defined in a way that the team can actually get their heads around, put an estimate on and work on, you need to be looking harder at refining that. Small is more around the achievability of something within a sprint. The bigger it is, the less likely you can chunk it into one sprint. And testable. Every story needs to have quality and acceptance criteria. Every story needs to have a definition of done. The team needs to know what they're building against, and you need to know what you're testing against in your approval. If you guys want more detail about the invest model, there's a link at the bottom from Agile Alliance that can help you. So let's say you're at the point where you want to apply the invest model and the requirement's too high level, right? It's still at a too high level. If that happens, there are techniques to split out the story. If it's a workflow, you can look at each step individually and possibly sub-steps. If it's a compound statement, it's amazing to me if you look at some people's requirements, it's actually 3 or 4 or 5 requirements built into one. Split those out. Have individual discussions about each part of that statement. And make sure you clarify ambiguous terms. I want to manage my team's time. Well, what does that really mean? Oh, I want to view it and I want to be able to, change a commitment. And once you talk through high-level terms like manage or process, I want to process an application. Well, tell me what that really means. you'll find that you actually get the functional requirements out of that discussion in a more meaningful way than simply the word process. And there's a link at the bottom, Agile for All, if you want to get more details. And there's actually a bunch of other resources out there on techniques for splitting stories. I'm going to do a quick time check, okay? If the requirement is too detailed, and again, we talked about the people that come to the table with a ton of technical knowledge, and so what they're describing is effectively a system feature, you need to get them to step back. What is the business ask? Don't tell me about what the system's supposed to do. Tell me about why it's supposed to do it. What are you trying to achieve? And get them to talk through it. There was a session earlier on in the Miro conference where they were talking about not only using words, but using pictures is a way to express. And that might be a way for somebody to express something they can't put into the right words. Finding shared stories across requirements. A lot of detailed stories can be coupled or grouped together and effectively become one business requirement. If you choose to look at it that way and put them all together, see if you can come up with a new sticky note that represents the full set. Identify the business drivers, like we said before. Why are you doing this? Ask for a one-sentence description. That's a great way to do this, right? I know you've described it in all these 20 different ways. How would you encapsulate it into one? If the requirement is unclear, right? If they basically have not been able to put it into words that are meaningful or definitive, work backwards. This is test-driven development techniques. Define the acceptance criteria, define what they would be looking for in the feature, and by virtue of that, you can actually define what the feature needs to do. Restructure the user story. Sometimes it's simply a rewording that can help clarify. Ask for real-life examples. It's hard for them to state it in general, but if they give you examples of pain points, that might help. And if that person really is struggling to express themselves, ask other stakeholders. You might be able to get a clear requirement that way. So I'm going to take a second and jump us out of the slide deck in favor of doing something with you guys really quickly, which is I want you to have a quick look at these sticky notes I'm about to show you. And I would love for you guys, in looking at these sticky notes, and hopefully they're legible, I'd like you to read all 4 of these user stories that are up on your board after the brainstorming session. And could you please put in the chat the letter of the user story that should be at the top of the backlog, the most important criterion? I'll give you guys a minute to put things in the chat or the Q&A. And let's have a quick look. Okay, so this question is quite deliberately a little bit of a trick question, because inevitably the question that's going to come on the table is, well, it matters in my organization, right? But if you guys look at these stories, in some respects, they're all really based on the requirements of that specific product or those specific stakeholders or your organization. For some organizations, a variety of customers will be using PayPal. If you don't support PayPal, you're going to lose an entire chunk of your customer base. Other organizations, international currency is critical. If you don't support euros, you're going to lose your European base. And for some organizations, neither of those things matters, right? So everything is contingent upon the decision-making of the product owner and the context of the information they've gathered and the needs of your organization. All right, so we're going to go back and we're going to try and get the presentation slides again. And we're going to finish off the rest of this. Okay, so when we talk about business value of each user story, the most common thing that people immediately think about is increasing revenue, right? In a commercial organization, that's a big driver. But there are lots of other things that define business value outside of revenue alone. One of the less quantifiable ones, but certainly no less important, is increasing customer or stakeholder employee satisfaction. And if the feature does something to move that in the right direction, that's valuable. Reducing risk or complexity and all the issues around that, huge business value. reducing cost or time. It's the corollary to increasing revenue, is reducing the amount you have spent of that revenue that you've earned. Complying with mandates. There's an argument that says this is an immovable rock. No matter what else you build in the solution, if it is not compliant, if it can't go live, then nothing else you do is important. So that's the highest priority. It improves quality. Again, the risk management, that's the opposite side of it. Or it eliminates waste, rework and miscommunication, which is the reducing cost and time. So identifying the business value is not exclusively increasing revenue or decreasing overhead. It's thinking harder about what the direct and indirect value of each feature could be. When you have defined that value. The Agile approach, the most common approach, is something called planning poker, which is basically applying a numeric value to each sticky note. And it uses a Fibonacci sequence, which has, degree measure of numbers increasing. I choose to modify that. I believe that it's valuable to put something called 100 in that sequence because of things like the immovable rocks, the compliance requirements. They're things that go to the top of the list no matter what. And so those need to be up there, and then everything else is relative to those numbers. Another way to do this is by assigning language. And I know a lot of organizations like to use critical and high and medium and low. I choose not to use those in these sessions. And the reason I do is because they can be emotive. I've sat in rooms where somebody says, what do you mean that's not critical? It's critical to me. And then it ends up becoming almost a resentment kind of argument discussion as opposed to a business value discussion. So I choose to use relative importance, more or less important. Other people might choose different language, but I would strongly recommend you choose language that gives you that value without getting people on the back foot or getting them in defensive mode. This is the most important statement. If you take nothing out of the session than the last statement on the slide, this is not a one-time deal. People tend to come to the table with a waterfall mindset. If I don't get my priority at the top of the list now, I'm never going to get this. Agile's emergent. Every planning session is an opportunity to revisit and re-escalate critical requirements. Please remind the stakeholders of that. This is a first pass. It is not your only opportunity. When you have those priorities identified, you can put them on each sticky note. I tend not to do what's on the right-hand side, which is try to quantify it because of all the things we talked about before, satisfaction and things like that aren't always as easily quantifiable. Tend to use the priority numbers themselves. When you have those priorities identified and you have a value on each sticky note, the exercise takes care of itself. All you need to do is arrange the sticky notes top down, highest priority down. You need to, and of course, in doing that, you're going to find that there are often several sticky notes at the same level. So all these things are rated, 16 or whatever. How do I decide which one is to start with? This is where, as a business, you need to draw a line. What is the MVP? It doesn't matter if it's done in 1, 2, or 20 sprints. What do we absolutely have to have in place before we go live, and draw that line under whatever group of sticky notes qualifies? Use a technique that I like to use, especially if there are hundreds of sticky notes and people don't even know where to begin, is the top 5, bottom 5 technique. So top 5, if we only had this team for 4 weeks and all we could build is the top 5 things of all these sticky notes, let's agree on the things that are absolute deal breakers. You have to choose. And the same thing applies for the bottom 5. Sometimes it's easier to cull the list by taking things out. And as you do, you begin to narrow down on the priority items as well. But same discussion. If we didn't have the funds and we have to take 5 things off this list, what would those 5 things be? And it tends to make the big pool of requirements a little more manageable. The last thing I want to emphasize, there's a tendency for teams to build a backlog once and then sort of leave it stale. Each planning session becomes a revisit the top 3 items in the previous session and not a revisit of the whole backlog. And it's worth, it might not have to be every time, regularly revisiting, refreshing, because things are going to change in your organization, outside the organization. That's the nature of Agile, is to support that, but you've got to replicate that in the product backlog. And I think we're just about on time. plug for my books, including the one in yellow, which I really think is the most valuable for this discussion, Power of the Agile Business Analyst. And if there's any questions, please stay on. Feel free to put them in the Q&A and in the chat. And if not, here's my contact information, my email. Feel free to send me any questions you have or information you're looking for, and I'll do my best to help you. Thank you very much and have a great time at the conference.